I found a journal in my late husband's office with another woman's name written on the cover. My hands shook as I opened it. My heart shattered when I started reading. Every entry was addressed to her. He wrote about meeting her, about stolen moments, about lying to me. I thought I'd discovered proof of an affair that destroyed everything I believed about my 26-year marriage. But as I forced myself to keep reading through the tears, I realized this wasn't what I thought at all. The last entry was dated 3 days before David died, and it said something that stopped my heart. If she's reading this, it means I'm gone. She needs to know the truth about why I've been lying to her for 6 months. What I discovered in those pages didn't just change how I saw my husband. It changed my entire understanding of who we were as a family. I'm Stella Wright, and this is the story of the journal that broke my heart and then put it back together in a way I never expected. Before we start, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I love hearing from all of you. I'm 48 years old, and 6 months ago my husband David died suddenly from a heart attack. We'd been married for 26 years. 26 years of partnership, friendship, and the kind of love that makes ordinary life feel special. David was 51 when he died. He was a high school history teacher here in Portland, Maine. The kind of teacher students remembered years later because he actually cared about making the past come alive for them. We met when I was 22 and working as a nurse at Maine Medical Center. I was doing night shifts in pediatrics, exhausted all the time but loving the work. David was finishing his graduate degree in education. Our first date was at a tiny diner at 2 in the morning, right after my shift ended. He'd been waiting for 3 hours just to have breakfast with me. He sat in that diner reading a book about the Civil War and drinking terrible coffee because he didn't want to miss his chance. That's the kind of man David was. Patient, thoughtful, completely committed once he decided something mattered to him. We built a simple life together, nothing fancy or dramatic. David taught American history at Lincoln High School. I worked as a pediatric nurse until our daughter Natalie was born. Then I switched to part-time so I could be home more. We had our routines that other people might find boring, but that made us happy. Sunday morning pancakes where David would make faces on them with blueberries to make Natalie laugh. Friday movie nights where we'd let Natalie pick whatever she wanted, even if it meant watching the same animated film 12 times. A standing reservation at our favorite Italian restaurant for our anniversary every October. David was my best friend. We talked about everything. When my father died 8 years ago, David held me through countless sleepless nights and handled all the funeral arrangements because I couldn't function. When budget cuts at the school district threatened David's teaching position, I spent weeks researching other districts and helping him prepare for interviews. We were a team. Real partners who showed up for each other through everything life threw at us. Our daughter Natalie is 24 now. She moved to Boston 2 years ago for a job as a graphic designer. She's independent and creative, so much like her father in the way she sees the world. David was so proud of her. Then 6 months ago, on an ordinary Tuesday evening, everything ended. David was in his home office grading papers. I was in the kitchen making chicken and vegetables for dinner. I called out that food was ready. He didn't answer. I called again, louder this time. Still nothing. I walked down the hall to his office and found him slumped over his desk. I knew immediately something was terribly wrong. I'm a nurse. I've seen death before, but seeing it on someone you love is completely different. I called 911 and started CPR, even though some part of me already knew it was too late. The paramedics arrived within 6 minutes. They worked on him for 20 minutes before the lead paramedic looked at me and shook his head. David was gone. A massive heart attack. The medical examiner said later that it was so severe he probably lost consciousness within seconds. He didn't suffer. That was supposed to comfort me, but it didn't. It just meant I didn't even get to say goodbye. The grief was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. People say losing a spouse is like losing a part of yourself, but that doesn't capture it. It felt like the entire foundation of my life had crumbled. I'd wake up reaching for David and remember he wasn't there. I'd hear something funny and turn to tell him before remembering I was talking to empty air. Every single part of my day had been built around our partnership, and suddenly, I was navigating everything alone. Natalie came home from Boston immediately. She stayed for 2 weeks, helping with the funeral arrangements and just being there. But eventually, she had to go back to her job and her life. My younger sister Rosa lives nearby and checked on me constantly. She'd show up with groceries or just sit with me when the silence got too heavy. My grief support group at the community center helped too. Slowly, painfully, I started learning how to function again, but I couldn't touch David's office. For 6 months, that room stayed exactly as it was the night he died. His coffee mug was still on the desk with dried coffee residue at the bottom. His favorite gray cardigan hung on the back of his chair. Student papers he'd been grading were still scattered across the workspace, frozen in time. I'd walk past that closed door every day and feel the weight of what I was avoiding. Then last week, Rosa sat me down and gently said it was time. Not time to forget David or move on, but time to start going through his belongings. There might be important papers, financial documents, things Natalie might want to keep. I knew she was right. So last Saturday morning, I made myself a strong cup of coffee, opened that office door, and started the heartbreaking work of sorting through my husband's life. I started with the easy things because I needed to work my way up to the harder stuff. Books could be donated to the school library where David had taught for 18 years. Old teaching materials and lesson plans could be thrown away or offered to other history teachers. I worked slowly, touching each item like it might break, trying not to think too hard about what each object meant. His favorite coffee mug with the faded Lincoln High School logo, the desk calendar still showing the month he died, a framed photo of the 3 of us from Natalie's college graduation. Every single thing felt heavy with memory. After about 2 hours, I'd made good progress on the shelves and the desktop. Then I moved to the desk drawers. The top drawers were straightforward. Pens, sticky notes, paper clips, all the normal office supplies. But the bottom drawer on the right side was different. I'd never paid much attention to it before. David had always kept it locked, and when I'd asked about it years ago, he'd explained he kept confidential student records in there. Test scores, disciplinary notes, things protected by privacy laws. It made sense. So I'd never thought about it again, but now the drawer wasn't locked. I pulled it open easily. Inside were manila folders with old lesson plans, some family photos I'd forgotten we had, and a leather-bound journal I'd never seen before. It was beautiful, expensive looking, the kind of journal someone buys when they want their words to matter. The leather was deep brown, with subtle decorative tooling around the edges. I picked it up and it felt substantial in my hands. I opened to the first page, expecting maybe to find David's thoughts about teaching or notes for a book he'd always talked about writing someday. Instead, at the top of the page in David's distinctive slanted handwriting, I saw words that made my blood go cold. For Caroline Bishop. Caroline Bishop. I didn't know anyone by that name. David had never mentioned a Caroline in all our years together. My heart started beating faster. I told myself it could be anything. Maybe a student he was mentoring, maybe a colleague, but something about the way he'd written those words, the formality of it, felt wrong. I flipped through the pages with trembling hands, entry after entry, all written like letters to this Caroline woman. The date started 8 months ago, 2 months before David died. I forced myself to start reading the first entry, and with every word, I felt my world crumbling all over again. David wrote about meeting Caroline and feeling something he hadn't felt in years. He described her intelligence, the way she made him laugh, how easy it was to talk to her. He wrote about stolen afternoons and private conversations. He mentioned lying to me about where he'd been. He talked about feeling guilty but being unable to stop seeing her. Entry after entry painted a picture I never wanted to see. My husband, the man I'd trusted completely, had been living a double life. I dropped the journal on the desk like it had burned me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold on to anything. I sat down hard in David's desk chair, the same chair he'd died in, and tried to breathe. This couldn't be real. David wouldn't do this. We'd had a good marriage. We talked about everything. We were happy, weren't we? Or had I been blind this whole time? I picked up my phone and called Natalie. When she answered, I could barely get the words out. I told her I'd found a journal in her father's office. I told her about Caroline Bishop. I told her that David had been having an affair. Natalie was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "That didn't sound like Dad at all. There had to be more to the story. I should keep reading before jumping to conclusions." But I couldn't hear her logic through the roaring in my ear. 26 years of marriage, 26 years of partnership and trust, and it had all been a lie. I called my sister Rosa next. She drove over immediately. I showed her the journal, and she read several entries while I paced the office. When she looked up, her face was confused rather than angry. She said something felt strange about the way David was writing. The tone wasn't quite right for an affair, but I couldn't see past my own pain and betrayal. For 3 days, I didn't touch the journal again. I couldn't eat more than a few bites of anything. I couldn't sleep for more than an hour at a time. I kept replaying the last months of David's life, looking for signs I'd missed. He had been distracted sometimes, staring off into space during dinner. He'd taken a few phone calls and stepped into another room for privacy. He'd gone out on Saturday afternoons saying he needed to run errands, and I'd never questioned it. All the classic warning signs, and I'd been too trusting or too stupid to notice. I felt like a fool. Worse, I felt like I was grieving all over again, but this time, I was grieving the loss of who I thought David was. The man I'd loved and trusted had been a stranger. Our entire marriage felt like a lie. Had he ever really loved me? Had I ever really known him? The questions tortured me day and night. But on the 4th day, something Rosa had said kept nagging at me. If David had wanted to hide this affair, why would he keep a detailed journal in an unlocked drawer? Why would he write for Caroline Bishop on the first page like he wanted it to be found? It didn't make sense for someone trying to keep a secret. And David had been a smart man. If he'd been hiding an affair, he would have been more careful than this. Against every instinct telling me to throw the journal away and never look at it again, I forced myself to pick it up. If I was going to spend the rest of my life hating David's memory, I at least needed to know the complete truth. So I sat down in his office, opened to the first page, and started reading every single entry from beginning to end. No matter how much each word felt like a knife to my heart, I read for hours, forcing myself through every painful word. At first, the entries seemed to confirm my worst fears. David wrote about meeting Caroline for coffee, about how talking to her felt natural and easy. He mentioned conversations that lasted for hours. He wrote about feeling alive in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. But as I kept reading, something started to feel off. The language wasn't quite right. David never mentioned physical attraction. He never wrote about wanting to kiss her or hold her. He never expressed romantic desire at all. Instead, he kept using words like surreal and bittersweet and complicated. Then I reached an entry from 7 months ago that made me stop cold. David had written about how Caroline looked so much like her mother. He said she had the same green eyes and the same stubborn chin. He wrote that he saw Linda in every expression Caroline made, and it broke his heart all over again. Linda. That name hit me like a physical blow. I knew exactly who Linda was. David had told me about her once, years ago when we were first dating and sharing stories about our past relationships. Linda Morrison had been his college girlfriend. They'd been together for 3 years, and David had been planning to propose. Then Linda died in a car accident during their senior year. David said it had devastated him, and he'd never wanted to talk about it again. I'd respected that and never pushed him for details. Now my hands were shaking for a completely different reason. I reread that entry 3 times to make sure I understood correctly. Caroline looked like her mother. Caroline's mother was Linda, which meant Caroline was Linda's daughter. I did quick math in my head. If Linda died during college senior year, that was about 28 years ago. Caroline would be around 27 or 28 now. The timeline fit perfectly. My mind was racing. David hadn't been writing about a lover. He'd been writing about his dead girlfriend's daughter. But why had he kept this secret from me? Why hadn't he just told me he'd reconnected with Linda's child? I kept reading faster now, desperate for answers. The next entries explained everything. David wrote about getting a message on Facebook 8 months ago from someone named Carolyn Bishop. She'd said her mother was Linda Morrison, and she'd been searching for people who knew Linda. She had questions about her mother that no one in her family could answer. Linda's parents had both died years ago, and Caroline had grown up with only fragments of information about who her mother really was. David had agreed to meet Caroline for coffee. That first entry was dated 8 months ago, and it was full of shock and overwhelming emotion. David wrote about how strange and wonderful it felt to sit across from someone who looked exactly like Linda. He'd answered Caroline's questions about her mother. He told her stories about Linda's love of impressionist art, about her terrible habit of singing off-key in the car, about her dream of becoming an elementary school teacher. Caroline had cried hearing these stories, and David had felt honored to give her this connection to the mother she barely remembered. But then, I reached an entry from 6 months ago that changed everything again. The entry was longer than the others, and David's handwriting looked shaky, like he'd been upset while writing. He wrote about meeting Caroline for lunch that day. She'd seemed nervous and had something important to tell him. Then she'd said the words that turned David's entire world upside down. Linda had been pregnant when she died. Her parents had known, but never told David. They'd decided it was better that way since Linda was gone, and telling him would only cause more pain. Caroline had been born 6 months after Linda's death, delivered by emergency cesarean section. Linda's aunt and uncle had adopted her and raised her as their own. Caroline was David's daughter, a daughter he never knew existed until 6 months before his own death. I had to stop reading because I couldn't see through my tears anymore. This wasn't an affair. This wasn't a betrayal. This was a tragedy layered on top of another tragedy. David had lost Linda 28 years ago. Then he'd discovered he had a daughter with her, only to die 6 months later before he could fully build a relationship with her. And that daughter, Caroline, had finally found her biological father, only to lose him almost immediately. The entries after that revelation were heartbreaking to read. David wrote about feeling completely overwhelmed. He'd gone from being a father to one daughter to discovering he had 2 daughters. He wrote about his terror at telling me. He was afraid I'd feel betrayed or think he'd hidden something deliberately. He was afraid I'd resent Caroline for being a reminder of his past with Linda. Caroline had asked him to wait before telling anyone. She needed time to process the shock herself before her existence became public knowledge. She'd just lost her adoptive parents, the aunt and uncle who raised her, within the past 2 years. Learning that David was her biological father was overwhelming enough without immediately being thrust into a new family situation. So David had kept the secret, meeting Carolyn for lunch or coffee every week or two. He'd been getting to know his daughter, learning about her life, trying to make up for 27 years of absence that wasn't his fault. Every entry expressed his love for me and his guilt about keeping this from me. He wrote about how much he wanted to tell me, how he hated lying by omission, how he was just waiting for Caroline to feel ready. The second to last entry was dated 1 week before David died. He wrote that he'd finally convinced Caroline it was time to tell me the truth. They'd made plans to come to the house together the following Sunday. David would tell me everything, and Carolyn would meet me and Natalie. He wrote about how nervous he was, but also how hopeful. He wanted us to be a family. But David died on Tuesday, 4 days before that Sunday ever came. My hands were shaking so hard, I almost dropped the journal as I turned to the final entry. It was dated 3 days before David's death. The handwriting was hurried, like he'd written it quickly during a planning period at school or late at night when he couldn't sleep. The final entry started with words that made my heart stop. David had written, "If Stella is reading this, it means I'm gone. I pray she never has to find this journal this way, but if she does, she needs to know the truth." I could barely breathe as I kept reading. David explained everything in that final entry. He wrote about Carolyn Bishop being his daughter, about how he'd only discovered her existence 6 months earlier. He admitted he should have told me immediately, but he'd wanted to respect Caroline's wishes for privacy while she processed the shock. He called himself a coward for not being braver about bringing everyone together sooner. Then David wrote directly to me in a way that felt like he was sitting right there in the room. Stella, I love you more than anything in this world. You are my wife, my partner, my best friend, the love of my life. Nothing about Caroline changes that, but she is my daughter, and she's alone now. Her adoptive parents are gone. She has no other family except a biological father she barely got to know before I died. He was asking me, begging me really, to find Caroline if he was gone. He'd written her phone number and address on the next page. He said Caroline needed family. She needed me. He asked me not to let his mistakes hurt Caroline because she was innocent in all of this. The entry ended with David writing that he wanted me to tell Caroline he loved her. He wanted me to tell her he was proud to be her father. And he wanted me to tell her about Natalie. Tell her she has a sister, David had written in his final words of the journal. Tell her she's not alone. I sat on the floor of David's office, holding that journal against my chest, and sobbed harder than I had since the day he died. But this time, I wasn't crying from betrayal. I was crying from grief and loss and the overwhelming weight of understanding what David had been carrying alone. He hadn't been unfaithful. He'd been trying to navigate an impossible situation with no good answers. He'd made mistakes by keeping secrets, but they came from love and fear and respect for Caroline's feelings, not from any desire to hurt me. I thought about Caroline, a 27-year-old woman who'd grown up not knowing her biological father, who'd finally found him and started building a relationship, who'd been planning to meet me and Natalie that Sunday. And then her father died. Before any of that could happen, she'd been at David's funeral. She had to have been, but she'd stood in the back alone, unknown and unacknowledged, grieving a father she'd barely gotten to know, while his other family mourned him, surrounded by community and support. I turned the page with shaking hands. There, in David's careful handwriting, was a phone number with a Portland area code. Below it was an address. Caroline Bishop lived in an apartment building just 20 minutes from my house. She'd been this close the entire time. I didn't call. I couldn't trust myself to have this conversation over the phone. What would I even say? How do you explain to someone that you just discovered they exist, that your husband was their father, that everything is complicated and painful and you don't know how to feel about any of it? I needed to see her face. I needed to look into the eyes of the daughter my husband never told me about. I got in my car and drove to the address David had written down. My mind was completely blank during the drive. I couldn't think. I could only move forward because staying still felt impossible. The address led to a modest apartment building in a quiet neighborhood with maple trees lining the street. I parked and sat in my car. For almost 15 minutes, my hands gripping the steering wheel. What was I doing? What if Caroline didn't want to see me? What if she blamed me for taking David's time and attention during those final months? What if she resented me for being the wife David chose while she grew up without a father? But David's words kept echoing in my head. She needs family. She needs you. I forced myself to get out of the car and walk up to the building. The directory showed C. Bishop in apartment 2B on the second floor. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. I stood outside apartment 2B for a full minute before I could make myself knock. The woman who opened the door took my breath away. She was in her late 20s, with long dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and the most striking green eyes I'd ever seen. She didn't look much like David at all. She must have gotten most of her features from Linda, but there were small things. The determined set of her jaw when she was confused, the way she tilted her head slightly when processing something unexpected, the shape of her hands, little echoes of my husband in a stranger's face. "Can I help you?" Caroline asked politely, clearly confused about why a middle-aged woman she'd never met was standing at her door. My voice came out shakier than I wanted. "Are you Caroline Bishop?" All the color drained from Caroline's face. Her hand tightened on the doorframe. Yes. Who are you? I took a breath and said the words that would change both our lives. I'm Stella Wright. I was David's wife. Caroline's eyes immediately filled with tears. She took a step backward, and for a horrible moment I thought she was going to close the door in my face. Instead, she whispered, "He told you about me?" I shook my head, tears now streaming down my own face. No, he died before he could. But I found his journal today. I read everything. I know who you are. I know you're his daughter, and I know he loved you. We stood there in that doorway, two women connected by a man we'd both loved and lost in different ways. Two women who should have met months ago at a family dinner, but instead were meeting like this, in grief and confusion and desperate need. Then Caroline started crying, really crying, with her whole body shaking, and I found myself stepping forward and pulling her into a hug. This stranger, who was somehow family, this daughter my husband never got to fully claim. We held each other in that doorway and cried for David, and for all the time we'd lost, and for the family we should have been. Caroline invited me inside her small apartment, and we sat on her worn couch surrounded by half-packed moving boxes. She apologized for the mess and explained she'd been planning to move to a cheaper place. Money had been tight since her adoptive mother died and left her with medical bills. We sat there for a moment in awkward silence, and then everything just poured out. Caroline told me her whole story. She'd been raised by her mother Linda's aunt and uncle after Linda died in that car accident. They'd been good parents who loved her, but they'd always told her that her biological father was unknown. They said Linda had gotten pregnant from a brief relationship and never revealed who the man was. Caroline had believed that her entire life and made peace with never knowing where she came from. Then a year ago, her adoptive mother died of cancer. While sorting through papers and belongings, Caroline found a sealed envelope with her name on it in her mother's safe deposit box. Inside was a letter Linda had written right before she died in that accident. Linda had been 6 months pregnant and knew she might not survive, so she'd written the letter just in case. In it, she'd named David as the father and explained that she'd never told him about the pregnancy because she didn't want to trap him. She'd planned to tell him after graduation when they both had their lives more figured out, but she died before that conversation could happen. Linda had made her aunt and uncle promise never to contact David because she didn't want to burden him with a child he'd never chosen. Caroline spent months trying to decide what to do with this information. Finally, 8 months ago, she reached out to David through social media. Meeting him for the first time had been the most surreal experience of her life. And then, just when they were starting to really know each other, just when she was beginning to feel like she had a father for the first time ever, he died. Caroline's voice broke as she told me she'd wanted to come to the funeral, but didn't know if she had the right. She wasn't part of David's real life. She was just a secret he'd been keeping. So, she'd stood in the back of the church, hidden behind other mourners, and left before anyone could see her crying. I grabbed both her hands and told her she wasn't a secret David wanted to keep. I pulled out his journal and let her read his entries about her. Caroline cried, reading her father's words, learning how proud he'd been of her, how conflicted he'd felt about the secrecy, how much he'd wanted to bring our families together. When she finished reading, I told her about David's last wish. He'd wanted me to find her and tell her about her sister. Caroline looked terrified and confused, so I explained that Natalie was 24 and lived in Boston and deserved to know she had a sister. Caroline asked what if Natalie didn't want anything to do with her. What if David's other daughter resented her for existing? I smiled through my tears and told her that if Natalie reacted that way, then she wasn't the daughter David and I raised. I asked Caroline if I could call Natalie right then on speakerphone. Caroline nodded, looking like she might be sick from nervousness. When Natalie answered, I didn't waste time. I told her everything about the journal, about Caroline, about David's daughter he'd never known existed until those final months, about his plan to bring everyone together that never happened. There was a long silence on the other end. Then Natalie's voice came through, thick with emotion, asking if Caroline was there with me right now. When I said yes, Natalie asked if she could talk to her sister. If you're enjoying this story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and leave a comment telling me what you think about everything that happened. I handed my phone to Caroline, and the two sisters talked for over an hour. I sat there listening to them discover each other. They compared their lives, their interests, their memories of David from completely different perspectives. By the end of the call, they'd made plans for Natalie to drive home from Boston that weekend. Caroline would come to our house for dinner. We'd look through photo albums together and share stories about David. We'd start building the family he'd wanted us to be, but never got to see. That first dinner was both beautiful and heartbreaking. Natalie arrived from Boston with her car, packed full like she was planning to stay for weeks. Caroline showed up exactly on time, holding flowers and looking absolutely terrified. My sister Rosa came too for moral support. We gathered around the dining room table where David had eaten thousands of meals, and we shared our different pieces of him. Caroline told stories about meeting David for the first time and how patient and kind he'd been with all her questions about Linda. She showed us photos of her mother from before she died, and Natalie stared at them, seeing the young woman who'd loved our father decades before any of us existed. It could have been painful or awkward, but instead, it felt like finally completing a puzzle we hadn't known was missing pieces. Over the following months, Caroline became part of our lives in ways that felt both natural and miraculous. She and Natalie talked on the phone multiple times a week. They visited each other constantly, making up for 27 years of not knowing the other existed. Caroline came to family dinners every Sunday. She joined us when we visited David's grave on his birthday and told him about how his daughters had found each other. The three of us women created the family David had dreamed about but never got to see. The hardest part for me was accepting that David had lied by omission during those final months. I struggled with feeling betrayed, even though I understood his reasons. My grief counselor helped me see that David had been in an impossible position, trying to honor Caroline's need for privacy while dealing with his own shock at suddenly having another daughter. He'd made mistakes, but they came from confusion and love, not from any desire to deceive me. Eventually, I found peace with it. I wished he'd told me immediately. I wished we'd faced Caroline's existence together as partners, like we'd faced everything else in our marriage. But I understood why he'd hesitated, and I forgave him. A year after David's death, something beautiful happened. Natalie and Caroline decided to get matching tattoos to honor their father. They chose a small, open book design because David had been a teacher who loved history and story. They invited me to join them, and the three of us sat in a tattoo parlor getting tiny books inked on our wrists. We were marking ourselves as family in a way that felt permanent and real. I learned that families don't always form the way we expect. Sometimes they come together through tragedy and secrets and journals that break your heart before healing it. David made mistakes in those final months, but they were human mistakes made from a place of love and fear. The worst moment of my life, finding that journal and thinking David had betrayed me, actually turned out to be a gift. It led me to Caroline. It expanded our family. It showed me that love doesn't end with death, and neither do the complicated, beautiful ways people connect across time and loss and impossible circumstances. The journal that destroyed me also saved me. I just had to be brave enough to keep reading past the first painful chapter.